Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, where you will discover practical strategies to inspire you to boost the health and nutrition of your kids. I'm Jessica Donovan, a qualified naturopath specialising in kids' health, and I want to make it as easy as possible for you to raise healthy and happy kids. Let's get into it. Hello everyone, welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast. I'm excited to dive into the topic of sugar on today's episode of the podcast. Now, I think we all know that sugar is not good for our kids. Too much sugar is not good, but there's some complexities and nuances around sugar, like how much is too much. And I also want to acknowledge that it is difficult in the modern world today to keep our kids' sugar intake in check. You know, it is in everything that we are buying in terms of, foods off the supermarket shelves, and it can be hidden. It's really hard to figure out, how much sugar is in a particular product unless you are a very savvy label reader, because sugar can be labeled as a whole heap of different names. Just because we don't see sugar on the ingredients label, it doesn't mean there's no sugar in there, because there are dozens and dozens of different names that basically mean sugar. And so, I want to talk about some of the reasons that sugar isn't great for our kids, particularly when it comes to their gut health and their gut microbiome, their immune health, and of course their mood and their behaviour, which I think are the more obvious signs that we can sometimes see in our kids when they've had too much sugar. They might, act a bit more crazy. They might have those sugar crashes and get grumpy. But there are lots of things internally that are happening that are not great for our kids, that are less obvious, that we might not know about. So in Australia, the guidelines for children's sugar intake are very vague. They emphasize minimizing the consumption of added sugars to promote health and prevent chronic disease. So the Australian Dietary Guidelines recommend that children limit their intake of foods high in added sugars, and recommend that we provide kids with the recommended amounts from the 5 food groups and limit foods that are high in added sugars. But that doesn't give us much of a really sort of solid guideline, does it? If we go to what the World Health Organization recommends, and this is relevant for both adults and children, that we reduce the amount of free sugars or added sugars to less than 10% of a person's total energy intake. And keeping it below 5% provides additional health benefits. So for children, this equates to limiting sugar consumption to less than 10% of their daily energy intake, which on average is about somewhere between 6 and 12 teaspoons of free sugar or added sugar. Despite these recommendations, there are a significant number of kids and adults that exceed these suggested limits. So many of us and our kids are eating too much sugar, whether that is consistently or at, certain times. And one key recommendation if you've got younger children is that kids from 0 to 2 should avoid added sugars entirely. This is a time where we have complete control, maybe except for grandparents or childcare, but we have a lot more control of what our kids are eating. So we want to really avoid added sugars entirely during this time. And that's really important because this is where taste perceptions are set. And if we're feeding our young kids under 2 added sugars, they're going to get used to those sweet tastes. they're not going to really be very keen on food that doesn't have those sweeter tastes, like the foods we want them to eat more of, the vegetables, the good quality protein, the whole grains. And for kids from 3 to 12, we want to limit added sugar to a maximum of 6 teaspoons or 24 grams per day. So as we were saying before, it's kind of dependent on their overall energy intake. But if we're not scientists and mathematicians and we're not calculating everything, this can be really tricky. So I wouldn't get too caught up in all of this. We want to make sure we're reducing sugar in our kids' diet and really limiting the amount of added sugar they have in their diet. So to give you some context, 4 grams of sugar is equivalent to 1 teaspoon. So when we're talking about grams, remember that 4 grams is 1 teaspoon. So if we're talking about an average Australian child's diet and what they might be eating in a day, just to give you some examples of how much sugar might be included in these foods. So a bowl of cereal, an average bowl of cereal, let's say, that kids regularly eat Cocoa Pops or Frosties, for example, a 30-gram bowl, so that's 1 serving size. Remember, kids, especially older kids, will often have more cereal than that, especially because cereal is like very moreish, like it's not very satisfying because it's got all the sugar in it and it's got refined carbohydrates in it. So it's not very filling. Unless we're adding things like nuts and fiber and that sort of thing to it. So a serving size is 30 grams, which is quite a small amount, and that will contain 12 grams of sugar just in the cereal. So that's equivalent to about 3 teaspoons of sugar that they're getting first up in the morning. If we add some juice to that, which again, it's not necessarily added sugar, although some juices do have added sugar, it is still, but it's free sugar within juice. Juice is quite sugary. It's naturally occurring sugars from the fruit, but because we're taking all the fiber out when we're juicing, it becomes this free sugar. So it's, almost as bad as those added sugars. And so a glass of orange juice can have 20 grams or 5 teaspoons of sugar in it. So, that is giving us a really big hit of sugar to start the day, or our kids. Then they might have a muesli bar for morning snack, for example. An average muesli bar will contain somewhere between 8 and 12 grams of sugar, so 2 to 3 teaspoons of sugar in their morning snack. And that's just in 1 muesli bar. Let's say they are having a sandwich for lunch. There might be added sugar in the bread that they're eating. That could be sort of 4 grams of sugar or 1 teaspoon. They might be having a yogurt after their sandwich. Those yogurt pouches and kids' yogurts contain quite a lot of sugar. That can be, around sort of 7-8 grams of sugar, 2 teaspoons of sugar in there. And then they might be having a couple of biscuits for afternoon snack when they get home. Obviously, this isn't a very healthy diet plan, but this is what a lot of average Australian kids are eating. A couple of biscuits, chocolate biscuits, could contain 12 grams of sugar. That's what 2 Tim Tam biscuits contain. So that's another 3 teaspoons. And then at dinner time, sugar can be hidden in savoury foods as well. So if they're having, say, spaghetti bolognese, a very popular family dinner, and you're using a jarred sauce to make your spaghetti bolognese sauce, there can be 6 grams of sugar in the sauce. If you're making your sauce from scratch with tins of tomatoes or jars of tomato passata, that's how we make ours, you don't get that added sugar. But if you're using one of those pre-made pasta sauces, then they will nearly always contain sugar in them as well. And then they might be having some dessert. Let's say they have a scoop of ice cream, which can contain 20 grams of sugar in 1 scoop. So that's 5 teaspoons. So you can see how it adds up. And hopefully those of you listening to this podcast don't have that much sugar in your kids' diets. Hopefully, there are some healthier choices in there, but that gives you a good indication of how easy it is for the sugar intake in a child's diet to add up. And that will go well above the recommended amount of sugar in a child's diet. So if we add all of that up in terms of that sugar intake, there's about 90 grams of sugar in those foods that I have just listed out. And that is well above that recommended 24 grams of sugar per day. You know, it's well over, it's almost 4 times the amount of sugar. So it's very easy to go overboard with the sugar. Like I said, hopefully all of those things aren't included in your kids' diets. But if they are and you're listening, hopefully that's a bit of a wake-up call, because although it's easy for sugar to be, you know, for us to go overboard with sugar in our kids' diets and our own as well, there are some simple changes that we can make to start to reduce the amount of sugar in their diets as well. And I will be talking about that a bit more towards the end of this podcast. Let's talk about some of the negative effects of sugar on our children's health. So the first really obvious one is weight gain and obesity. So excessive sugar intake contributes to weight gain. It basically increases calorie consumption without providing essential nutrients. So it's like those empty calories. So we're getting lots of sugar within those calories, obviously, because we're talking about sugar, but we're not getting essential nutrients. And so this leads to, you know, weight gain. It can lead to obesity over time, which increases the risk of chronic diseases like diabetes and heart disease later on in life. And unfortunately, the stats on kids that are overweight or obese are on the rise. So I think we're all pretty familiar with the effect that sugar can have on weight and sugar levels, risk of diabetes and heart disease later on in life. Dental health is another consideration. So sugar feeds bacteria in the mouth that produces acid that erodes tooth enamel, and that leads to things like cavities and gum disease. So too much sugar in the diet can lead to issues with dental health. And then there are the blood sugar imbalances, the energy spikes and crashes, the blood sugar ups and downs. So when our kids eat a meal or a snack that is high in sugar, it causes our blood sugar to spike rapidly, to go up rapidly. And when our kids' blood sugar goes up, they're probably quite heightened, they're crazy, they're full of energy, but then not very long down the track, it is followed by a crash, and that can lead to irritability, grumpiness, those mood and behavioral challenges, as well as difficulty concentrating. So if our kids are eating a high sugar breakfast cereal, an average breakfast cereal before they go to school, then they're going to be getting that crash just as they get to school probably. And they're not going to find it easy, particularly some kids, to sit still, to concentrate and to learn. So those energy spikes and crashes, we probably see the effects of those in our kids. And then there are, generally behavioral issues that are linked with high sugar diets as well. So studies show that there's a link between high sugar consumption within the diet and hyperactivity. And this is particularly relevant with kids that are diagnosed ADHD, but it is very relevant for all kids. And I'm sure you've seen firsthand the behavioural challenges that a high sugar, meal or snack can create or cause in your child. And then there's nutritional deficiencies as well. So when kids consume lots of sugary foods, they're probably eating less nutrient-rich, nutrient-dense foods as well. So they're missing out, they're getting those empty calories rather than those nutrient-filled calories. So this can lead to deficiencies in vitamins and minerals, and these are things that we see all the time here at Natural Super Kids. You know, some of the common ones being deficiencies in iron and zinc and magnesium, just to name a few. So nutritional deficiencies are very common in kids with high sugar diets. And then over time, lots of sugar in the diet, it increases risk of chronic disease. Diabetes, we already mentioned, high blood pressure, fatty liver disease. These are things we're probably not thinking about, in terms of our kids, but these sorts of chronic diseases that are so prevalent in our Western society take years and years and years and years to develop. And so, our kids' sugar intake now will affect their health long term, particularly if we don't make some changes to kind of rein that all in. So, as I mentioned at the start, there are lots of negative effects when it comes to sugar and gut health and the gut microbiome. And if you're a regular listener or a long-time listener of the Natural Super Kids podcast, we talk about gut health a lot because it is so foundational to a child's overall well-being. Our child's gut health is not just about their digestive comfort and whether they get tummy aches or not, or whether they're constipated or not. Of course, these things are all signs that the gut is out of balance or needs some attention if our kids are, prone to constipation or tummy aches. But gut health is so much more than that. It affects our kids' immune system. It affects their allergy tolerance. It affects atopic conditions such as eczema and hay fever and asthma. It affects their mood, sleep, and behavior via the gut-brain connection. So when we're talking about gut health, this is relevant for everyone because we want our kids' gut health to be as healthy as possible and as balanced as possible. So what does sugar do when it comes to specific effects on the gut and the gut microbiome? Well, first of all, sugar feeds pathogenic or bad bacteria and also fungus like Candida, for example, that promotes an imbalance in the gut microbiome. So sugar is feeding the bad guys, which allows those to sort of take over and overgrow in the gut microbiome, which leads to what we call dysbiosis, an imbalance of good and bad bacteria within the gut microbiome, which can then lead on to lots of issues from there as well. Sugar also reduces the diversity of beneficial bacteria, which are so important. I mean, if we want to focus on one thing to improve our children's gut health, it is to improve that diversity. And sugar is reducing that diversity, which has a negative impact on their digestion, of course, their immunity, their mood, their sleep, their behavior, their eating preferences, and so much more. So that balance of good and bad bacteria, sugar puts that way out of whack, to put it really simply. Sugar can also increase inflammation within the gut. So those pathogenic bacteria that sugar feeds produce toxins that irritate the gut lining, and that leads to inflammation and potentially contributes to things like leaky gut syndrome, which again we see really commonly in the kids that we are supporting here at Natural Super Kids. And inflammation in the gut can lead to inflammation in other areas of the body as well. So very relevant for kids with inflammatory conditions such as eczema or asthma or enlarged tonsils and adenoids, for example, another condition or problem that we see so commonly in kids. A lot of that inflammation in other areas of the body is coming from the gut, either an imbalance in the gut or directly from that inflammation within the gut that sugar drives. Now, sugar also can reduce the production of short-chain fatty acids. So beneficial bacteria within the gut produce substances called short-chain fatty acids. And so this happens when the beneficial bacteria sort of consume fiber. And when they're fermenting that fiber, these short-chain fatty acids are produced. Now, these short-chain fatty acids are good for the gut. They nourish the gut. They reduce inflammation in the gut. They keep the gut lining healthy to reduce and prevent leaky gut. But when we eat lots of sugar in the diet, one thing it does is it reduces fiber consumption because sugary foods generally don't have a lot of fiber in them. And so a high sugar diet is often also a low fiber diet. So that lowers the production of these short chain fatty acids, which are very beneficial for the gut, and leads to more inflammation, more leaky gut, and more dysbiosis or imbalances within that gut microbiome. And sugar can also have a direct impact on digestive processes and nutrient absorption as well. So when we've got an imbalance in the good and bad bacteria in the gut, which I have explained sugar sort of is one of the things that drives that imbalance, it can impair the gut's ability to digest and break down food, absorb nutrients effectively, and that can lead to deficiencies that affect growth and development. And iron deficiency is a really great example here. We know that when kids are iron deficient, they often have absorption issues in the gut, which is often driven by inflammation in the gut, which is, sometimes driven by a high sugar diet. So reducing sugar in the diet can really reduce that gut inflammation, reduce imbalances in the gut microbiome, and overall make the gut much happier. And I want to also talk a little bit about the direct effects that sugar has on the immune system. So, as I said, I think most of us are aware that sugar, can make our kids a bit crazy, can make them irritable when they have that crash. But what a lot of people don't understand, and we have talked about this on the podcast before, is that sugar directly depletes our kids' immune system. So when our kids consume a high sugar meal or snack, it suppresses the immune system by impairing or slowing down the ability of the white blood cells to engulf and destroy harmful pathogens. So this effect can last several hours after a sugary meal. So in the winter particularly, this is a big problem if our kids are going off to school after a high sugar breakfast and they're coming in contact with germs from other kids. They're much more likely to get sick if they've had a high sugar meal or they have a high sugar diet generally, because it basically puts their white blood cells into slow motion. So they're not as effective at kind of targeting any pathogen that comes into the body. Our kids come in contact with germs all the time, and a lot of them they're fighting off in the background without getting sick. But when our white blood cell activity is reduced from a high sugar diet or just a high sugar meal or a high sugar snack, then the child is much more likely to get sick from that pathogen that they've come in contact with, rather than the body doing its thing in the background. Hopefully that makes sense. As I said, the sugar also feeds harmful gut bacteria, and this directly links to immunity. So sugar promotes the growth of pathogenic or bad bacteria in the gut, as I said earlier. This can lead to inflammation, and that can weaken the immune system. Also, when we're talking about inflammation, chronic inflammation or systemic inflammation, which excess sugar in the diet can contribute to, really, it diverts the immune system's resources or the energy from the immune system that the immune system would normally sort of have and use to keep the body healthy. It takes that energy away from the immune system, the defensive side of the immune system, because it needs to deal with the inflammation that the sugar is causing. And the other really relevant piece here that we've already mentioned is that leading to deficiencies. So the immune system is powered by nutrients. So things like zinc and vitamin C and vitamin A, just to name a few, are really important in proper healthy immune function. When our kids are eating too much sugar, as I said earlier, it can deplete those essential immune boosting nutrients, or those nutrients that are required for the immune system to function healthily. So things like vitamin C and magnesium and zinc are, examples of this. And lastly, sugar can lead to weakened mucosal barriers. So that sugar-led or sugar-induced dysbiosis and inflammation, it compromises the gut lining, which serves as a first line of defense against pathogens. We've talked before about how important gut health is when it comes to the immune system, and that 80 to 90% of our immune system is actually located in the gut. And so when sugar is reducing that, the health of the gut, it can really impact the immune system. So there are a lot of negative effects on our kids' health that sugar has, and hopefully that has highlighted those things for you or reminded you of some of the reasons we really do want to prioritize keeping sugar lower in our kids' diet. And I will, I'll be the first to say that this is not easy. I have two teenagers, they're in that independent stage of life where they're out with their friends, they're making their own food choices. So my kids certainly are not perfect in this sugar area. And putting this podcast together and this information together has, reminded me of the importance of keeping sugar down in our kids' diets and all of the reasons why that is going to be beneficial. So a couple of things, it's a big project to try and reduce sugar, and I would say take it step by step. If you've listened to this and you're going to go to your kids and say, right, no more sugar, it's probably not going to go down very well. So I would slowly work on this in the background. And the two areas where we see lots of sugar in kids' diets is at breakfast time for a lot of kids, and also at snack times. So they're the places to start. Can we swap from the sugary breakfast cereal to a homemade muesli or a homemade granola or a savory breakfast, an egg-based breakfast, a smoothie? And we have a free resource to make this easier for you. So we've put together 3 great recipes that are low in sugar, high in protein, high in essential fats, high in nutrients, that you can look to replace your kids' current breakfast with. So to get a copy of that, head to naturalsuperkids.com/breakfast, and you can download our 3 breakfast recipes to improve your kids' mood and behavior that are very low in sugar and high in, as I said, nutrients, protein, and fat, which balance out those sugar levels as well. So you'll get some ideas in there for those breakfast recipes. If your kids are drinking a lot of sugar, juice, soft drinks, then try and start to reduce those, water them down, replace with unsweetened options, and remember that the best drink for our kids is water. And if our kids are drinking a lot of fruit juice, we want to, really remember that whole fruit is much better than fruit juice because it's got the fiber in it, which helps to reduce that sugar breakdown in the body. When we're juicing fruit and taking that fiber away, it's very high in those free sugars. And the other area that we can look at making changes in is are snacks. So we talked about muesli bars and yogurts and biscuits. One of the best things you can do is bake yourself at home, so you can control how much sugar goes in. You are going to add sugar to things like muffins and cakes and biscuits and muesli bars if you're making them at home, but you can really reduce the amount of sugar, and you can make sure there's lots of high fiber ingredients. You can use a higher fiber flour. You can add nuts and seeds and coconut and all of those good things to it that a lot of the store-bought varieties don't have as well. And then when we're choosing things like yogurts and muesli bars, it's okay to buy these things, but we want to just have a look at the sugar content and try and choose a brand that is lower in sugar. If we can opt for plain yogurt and add fresh fruit to it, and maybe even a little bit of sweetener, a bit of honey, a bit of maple syrup, that's going to be generally a much better option than many of the store-bought varieties. So make some changes to breakfast and snacks, and include more savory snacks in your kids' diet as well. Don't forget that ebook we have with the breakfast recipes. That is a great place to start, especially if your kids are eating high sugar breakfast cereals at the moment, and starting their day with those. So that is naturalsuperkids.com/breakfast. And I would love to hear how you go with those recipes. Hopefully this has been helpful, and I will be back next week. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Head on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com, for the show notes for this episode, as well as a whole heap of inspiration to help you raise healthy and happy kids. I'll see you next week.